The freighter Marantholis died in the middle of a word. I was on the night watch at Telmac Anchorage when her transmission came through the relay, a routine position call, the navigator reading coordinates in the flat-board voice of a being who has read 10,000 of them, and then the voice stopped between one number and the next. Not a scream, not an alarm. The carrier wave itself simply ended, the way a candle ends when a door opens somewhere in a large house. I logged the time. I am a lane warden. Logging the time is what I am for. Then I sat in the dark of the watch chamber with my hands flat on the console, and I did not call it in for a full minute because I already knew what the Verge Council would say, and I wanted 1 minute of silence before they began saying it. The Marantholis was the first ship to die on the reopened lane. She would not be the last. By the end of that season, the ledger in front of me would carry 90 names, and I would have written every one of them in my own hand, and not one of those 90 ships would ever pass the beacon line again in either direction. I want that number stated plainly at the start, because everything the council said that year was designed to keep anyone from stating it plainly, and I am too old now to speak any way but plainly. My name is Savithor Untal. I am Dravani of the carrier lineages hatched on the orbital terraces of Dress. For 31 years I have kept the lane warden's watch at Telmac Anchorage, the last fueling and clearance station on the Cassern Verge, the place where the civilized routes stop. Beyond my beacon line lies the volume the charts call Interdict 9 and the crews call the Hollow Reach. Beyond the Hollow Reach lies human space. I have been inside the Hollow Reach once. I came back. Those two sentences are the whole reason the council ever pretended to listen to me, and the whole reason they could never afford to. 11 days before the Marantholis died, the Verge Council voted to reopen the lane. They did not consult Telmac. A courier packet arrived with the new routing schedules already printed, the tariff tables already calculated, the proclamation already sealed, the old transit corridor through the edge of Interdict 9, the one my grandmother's generation had sealed, the one that had stood closed for 140 years, was to be open to commercial traffic at the start of the high carriage season. The reasoning was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was real. The long route around the interdict costs a laden freighter 60 days. The old lane through its margin cost 9. The Olmec tariff war had gutted shipping profits for 3 years running. The grain stations of the Cassern Verge were 2 seasons behind on deliveries, and the Yeltith Combine, which owned half the hulls on the Verge and a more useful fraction of the council, had petitioned for the lane in language that mentioned starving settlements 11 times and the word human not once. That was the detail I noticed first, reading the proclamation in the cold of the watch chamber. 11 mentions of hunger. No mention at all of why the lane had been closed. I filed an objection the same night. I used the official channel and the official form because I am an official being, and I stated my grounds in the dry language the form demanded. Ground 1. The interior beacons of the old lane had been silent for 140 years, and no survey had been flown to establish why. Ground 2. The lane's margin passes within 4 light days of the boundary of human space, and the boundary of human space is not a line that has ever been negotiated, published, or confirmed. It is a line drawn by us, from our side, by watching where our ships stopped coming back. Ground 3. I had personal knowledge, entered into the record 40 years prior, of conditions inside the interdict. The reply came back in 6 days, faster than condolences and slower than tariff money moves. Objection noted and overruled. The lane warden's concerns reflect events 4 decades past and conditions which cannot be verified. There it was, the whole shape of the coming year in a single sentence. What cannot be verified can be ignored. They had made my one crossing into a story, and stories do not appear on manifests. So the lane opened. The first ships went through in convoy holiday, with bunting on the docking arms of my own station, with a council delegate making a speech from Telmac's observation ring about the new age of the Verge. I stood at the back in my warden's grays and watched 12 freighters form up and run the beacon line, 12 drives flaring against that black margin where there are too few stars, and I will not pretend I felt dread, not yet, not exactly. What I felt was the specific cold of a being watching others walk out onto ice he has personally fallen through. 11 of the 12 reached the far relay at Chorus Landing on schedule. Their masters sent back transit logs full of nothing, clean running, dead beacons drifting in the dark, an old monument buoy from the closure era still tumbling end over end where the lane bends closest to the boundary. Nothing else, no contacts, no hails. The 12th was the Marantholis, and she died in the middle of a word. I called it in after my 1 minute of silence. The protocols for a lost ship are old and good, and I ran all of them. Relay sweep, beacon interrogation, drive flare survey of her last log position, conducted from my side of the line by long lens, because Telmac's charter forbids the station's boats from crossing the beacon line, a clause I wrote myself 18 years ago and have never once regretted. The sweep found the usual ghosts and the lens found nothing at all. No wreck, no drive residue, no debris bloom, and a freighter of her tonnage coming apart leaves a debris bloom you can map from a light day out. The Marantholus had not exploded, had not collided, had not burned. She had been subtracted. I wrote that word in my preliminary report, and the Council's Traffic Bureau struck it out and wrote presumed lost to navigational error. And that was the first lie of the season. I want to be exact about it because the lies were always small at the beginning, always administrative, always reasonable. A struck word, an adjusted category, a finding of error against a navigator with 30 years of clean transits, whose last recorded act was reading a position call in a bored voice on a calm night. Vessel loss is ordinary, the Bureau wrote to me, in the matter of the Marantholus. The Verge loses hulls every season to error and age and bad fortune. The lane warden is reminded that one loss among 12 transits is within actuarial expectation. It was even true. That is what I have learned about the worst lies. The first one is usually true. The second ship was the Culvera, 9 days later, outbound and heavy with seed grain. She made her position calls past the third beacon, past the fourth, and then between the fourth and the fifth she stopped, and there was no last transmission at all this time, no word cut in half, just an interval where her next call should have sat and did not. I ran the protocols. I found nothing. There is a kind of nothing that is simply absence, and there is a kind of nothing that is a made thing, manufactured, perfect. And any being who has kept a long watch on a quiet border knows the difference in their gut before they can defend it in a hearing. The nothing where the Culvera had been was the second kind. It had no edges. Wreckage has edges. The Bureau logged her as a probable piracy loss, and that word, piracy, went up the channels to the Council, and I watched it go the way you watch a spark land in dry tinder. Because piracy was a usable word. Piracy had a face, a remedy, a budget line. Piracy could be patrolled against, and patrols could be funded, and the lane could stay open while they were. I sent a private message that night to the one member of the Verge Council I had ever trusted, an old Olmec treaty clerk named Dovalth, who had been at Telmac the year I came back out of the Hollow Reach, and had read my debrief when it was still raw before the archivist sanded it smooth. I wrote, 2 hulls in 9 days on a lane that was closed for 140 years. You have read what I saw in there. You know there are no pirates inside Interdict 9. Nothing makes a living in there. Nothing is permitted to. Dovalth wrote back 4 words, and I have kept them, because they were the most honest thing any official said to me that entire year. I know. Keep counting. So I kept counting. It is what I am for. The ledger I opened that night was a plain Cargo Master's book, paper board covers, because I wanted the record to exist somewhere that could not be struck through remotely by a traffic bureau with a stylus and a mandate. I ruled 3 columns: name, date of entry into the lane, date of exit. By midwinter of the high carriage season, the 3rd column had stopped being a column. It was just a margin where my hand had written the same words so many times the letters had worn a groove into the page beneath. None, none, none. But I am ahead of myself, and an old warden should keep his beacons in order. In those first weeks, the lane was still a success. That is the part the young ones never believe when I tell it. Between the losses, around them, over them, the lane worked. Freighters cut 60 days to 9. Grain reached stations that had been rationing for a year. The combine stock issues doubled. The council delegate who had cut the ribbon at Telmac was promoted to the Verge's central seat, and her first act was to commission a survey of widening the lane's margin, moving it closer to the boundary of human space to fit 3 convoys abreast. Her name was HFY Var, remember the name. She was not a fool and she was not a monster, and I have come to believe those 2 facts made everything worse. Because a fool could have been corrected and a monster could have been blamed. HFY Var was something far more dangerous than either. She was a competent official with good arithmetic, looking at a ledger of her own, and on her ledger the lane was saving more lives than it was losing. For a while, you understand, both our ledgers were right. Then the Seleth Vane went in with a crew of 40 and a hold full of pilgrim families bound for the Kira shrines, 106 souls aboard, and the interval where her 5th position call should have been sat empty on my board like a pulled tooth, and after that night I never again thought of the lane as a road. I thought of it as a tide pool. The kind children poke with sticks at low water, where everything seems still and bright and shallow. The tide had simply not come back in yet, and 40 years before, alone among all the living beings on the Cassern Verge, I had seen the thing that lived below the tide lane, and I had heard it speak, and it had known my ship's name before I ever sent a hail. The Seleth Vane changed the politics. Because pilgrims have families and families write letters, and for the first time the losses on the lane had names that were not just entries in cargo registry. 106 souls. The shrine orders on Chorus Landing declared a season of lament. A delegation of bereaved came to Telmac on the next packet, and they stood at my observation ring and looked out at the beacon line and the black margin beyond it, and one of them, an old Charon matriarch with mourning chalk on her forearms, asked me the question the entire Verge had been not asking for 140 years. What is in there, Warden? I gave her the answer I'd given the council, the bureau, and my own night thoughts. I said, nothing is in there, Mother. That is the whole of what I know and the whole of what is wrong. There is nothing in there, and ships that go in do not come out. And those two facts have lived together comfortably in that darkness since before either of us was hatched. She looked at me for a long time. Charon eyes are stacked in tears, and when all the tears fix on you at once you feel red, the way a page feels red. Then she said, my grandmother's generation closed that lane. She would never say why. She would only say that the closing was not ours. Not ours. I wrote that in the ledger too, in the back pages where I kept the things that had no column. The closure proclamation of 140 years ago is a public document. Any clerk can pull it. It runs 4 lines. It cites no incident, no casualty figure, no enemy. It reads less like a law than like a thing dictated under instruction, and the 4 lines do not contain the word human. And somehow that absence is the loudest thing in the document. The generation that wrote it sealed their session minutes for 200 years. They had 60 more years of silence still owed to them, and the Verge Council of my own day had decided not to wait. HFY Var came to Telmac in person 8 days after the Seleth vein was lost. She arrived without bunting this time, 2 aides and a recorder, and she sat in my watch chamber with the lens displays casting their long, slow sweep across her face, and I will say this for her. She read the whole ledger, every line. Most officials weigh a document in their hand and read its first page. She read the 3rd column, the margin worn into a groove, the word none repeated like a litany, and her face did not move, but her hands did. She closed the board cover very carefully, the way you close a door in a house where someone is sleeping. Then she said, Warden, I am going to tell you what I can do and what I cannot do, and I would ask you to extend me the courtesy of believing both. I cannot close the lane. The Verge ate through its grain reserves during the tariff war. 11 stations are within 1 failed season of evacuation. The long route cannot feed them. The arithmetic has been run by better mathematicians than either of us. If I close the lane, beings die. In numbers I can show you, with names I can give you. That is not rhetoric. That is the floor I stand on. And what can you do, I asked. I can find out what is taking my ships, she said. I noted I noted that the losses had become hers in the same breath that the closure had. Become impossible. And I understood that I was watching a being build the architecture of justification in real time, the way the records say the old coalition admirals did before the quieting 3 centuries ago, in the war whose ending no one alive has ever described. But I also noted that she had said find out and not deny, and on the Verge that year, that made her the closest thing I had to an ally. So I told her what the instruments had. I am a careful being, and it was a short list, but it was not nothing, and no one above my station had ever sat still long enough to hear it. Item 1. Every lost ship was lost between the 4th beacon and the 6th, the stretch where the lane bends to within 4 light days of the human boundary. No ship had ever been lost on the outer stretches. The losses had a geography. Item 2. The losses had no debris, no drive residue, no distress signature, and no survivors across 9 separate events. Piracy leaves at least one of those things every time. Mines leave 2. Reefs of dark mass leave 3. There is no natural or criminal phenomenon in the registry of the Verge that leaves none 9 times in a row. Item 3. And I laid this one down slowly because it had cost me 3 weeks of cross-checking transit logs to be sure of it. The ships that died were not random. Out of every convoy, the lane took the hindmost, or the straggler, or the one that had drifted wide of the mark channel to shave time off the bend. The 11 ships of that first convoy had held tight formation, all but the Marin Tholis, whose master had eased her 2 light hours wide of the channel to catch a gravity slope. Each loss since had the same shape. The lane did not take ships. It took ships that crossed some line that none of our charts showed, but all the losses drew. Var's senior aide, a young Dravani with combine pins on his collar, laughed at that. A short, scoffing laugh, the laugh of arithmetic at folklore. You are describing a boundary patrol, he said. A picket enforcing a border. Warden, with respect, there has been no signal traffic out of human space in 300 years. Every Academy survey concludes the volume is dead. Whatever wrecked your grandmother's ships is long since dust. Nothing watches a border for 3 centuries. We do, I said, at Telmac. Why would they be worse at it than us? The aide did not laugh again. Var looked at me for a long moment, and then she asked the question I had been waiting 11 years of her career for someone in her seat to ask. She said, Warden, your file says you have been inside the interdict. Not the lane, the deep volume. It says you came back. The debrief is sealed under your own request. Why? Because the last time it was open, I said the council that day read it, called it trauma delirium, and nearly took my license. I sealed it to keep it from being sanded down into something explainable. The day a council asks me to unseal it and promises to hear it whole, I will. I am asking, she said. Not yet, I said. You are asking what is taking your ships. When you are ready to ask what is letting the rest of them through, come back and I will unseal it. I have wondered many nights since whether that refusal was vanity, an old being hoarding the one coin he had left. I do not think it was. I think I knew that the debrief, heard too early, would simply be spent, filed, leaked, mocked, drowned in the next season's tariff brawls, and that there would come a worse night when it would be the only currency on the verge worth anything. I was right about the worst night. I take no satisfaction in it. Var left Telmak with my lost geography charts and a commitment, which she kept, to suspend wide channel transits and order all convoys into tight formation down the marked center of the lane. And here is the bitter wonder of it. It worked. For 19 days it worked. 11 convoys ran the lane nose to tail like beads on a cord, every master holding the center channel as if the markings were a bridge over a gorge, and nothing was subtracted, and my third column gathered no new entries, and on chorus landing the shrine orders rang the lament bells down to quarter morning. For 19 days the Verge allowed itself to believe the problem was procedural, that the darkness could be negotiated with through formation discipline. The Combine's bulletins called it the Corridor Protocol, and there was talk of expanding tonnage, and Hesheline Var was confirmed to the central seat by acclamation. I spent those 19 days at the long lens, watching the bend where the lane runs closest to human space, because something in the new quiet was worse than the losses. It took me until the 17th day to name it. The interior beacons of the old lane, dead for 140 years, drifting, tumbling, inert through every survey ever flown, had stopped tumbling, all 6 of them. The old monument buoy, too. Between one of my watch cycles and the next, every derelict object along that bend had gone still, oriented, aligned along the axis of the lane like iron filings over a magnet that someone had, very quietly switched back on. I photographed it, timed it, verified it through 2 independent lenses, and sent it up the channel under my warden's seal with a 1-line annotation, the most carefully chosen line of my career, because I knew the Bureau would be reading over Var's shoulder. Annotation. The lane is not unpatrolled. It has been listening. As of this date, it has begun to answer. The annotation cost me. I knew it would when I wrote it, and I wrote it anyway, because a warden seal that will not spend itself on the truth is just jewelry. Within 2 days, the Traffic Bureau circulated a memorandum to all Verge stations on the subject of speculative language in official reporting. It did not name me. It did not have to. The memorandum reminded all wardens and relay masters that anomaly reports must confine themselves to instrument data and refrain from attributing intent to natural phenomena, and it attached as a cautionary example with the seal scrubbed, my own beacon report, my funnel charts, my timing tables, my 1 line of annotation reformatted as an exhibit of what a long solitary posting does to professional judgment. I am told it was read aloud in the Combine's wardroom on Chorus Landing to general amusement. I am told the phrase the Hermit of Telmak enjoyed a season of currency. I logged the memorandum and filed it with the rest. But I record here what it broke, because the breaking mattered later. Coden Vry, the relay master at the chorus end of the lane, the being who had countersigned every one of my loss reports from the far side, whose own boards had watched the same intervals open in the same silence, read that memorandum and read my raw beacon data, which I had sent him entire, and resigned his post within the week. He did not resign quietly. He stood in the chorus traffic hall in front of the morning shift and said, in words that several beings wrote down, I have checked the warden's figures 4 times. The beacons moved. Dead iron does not drill itself into formation. You may laugh at the Hermit on your own time, but I have a hatchery on Chorus, and I will not keep the books of a port that has decided not to know what is forming up outside it. The Bureau processed his resignation as a health matter. His deputy took the far relay, a young being with combine pins. And after that, the loss reports from the Chorus end began arriving pre-categorized, each one filed under its cause before any investigation had been flown. The machinery was learning to metabolize the deaths faster than I could record them. That is what the quiet 19 days bought the Verge in the end. Not safety, fluency. Then the Corridor Protocol met the bright custom, and I stopped being the only witness on this border. She was a fast packet hauler, 11 crew, and on the 20th day of the protocol, her master took her up the lane in convoy. And at the bend, with the discipline fraying the way discipline frays when nothing has gone wrong for 19 days, eased her out of file to pass a slower hull, 2 light hours wide of the marked channel. I watched her lamp the whole way, my hand flat beside the relay key, doing the one arithmetic that mattered. She was outside the line, she was the straggler, she was next, and her lamp did not go out. Something else happened instead, and I have her master's deposition in my ledger's back pages, taken by my own hand before the bureau could reach her, and I will give it as she gave it. She said the helm went soft. Not dead soft, the way a stylus goes soft in a strong magnetic field, answering but answering slowly, as if the ship's mass had been gathered up in something's regard. She said the bright custom came around onto a heading no one aboard had laid in, smooth, unhurried, and ran back down into the marked channel and settled into file like a beast returned to a paddock, and the helm came back live between one breath and the next, and the whole correction had taken 4 minutes and had felt, she said, and she was a hard being, 20 years on the packet runs, and her hands shook saying it. It felt courteous. It felt like being taken by the elbow. 11 crew felt the same 4 minutes. 11 depositions had anyone above my station wanted them. The dark at the bend had reached into a laden hull in full view of a convoy and set it gently back inside the lines. And the act said more plainly than any annotation of mine, the rules are not weather, they are enforced. There is a hand. The hand is patient, and the patience is policy. And the policy has limits, and you have been spending them. The Bureau ruled it a gravitational eddy and an episode of crew suggestion, and rated the bright customs master for psychiatric review, and she sold her ship that season and went to ground on chorus, and the bulletins never carried a word of it. But the crews carried it. Crews always carry it. By the 22nd day, every bonding house on the verge knew a version of the elbow story, and the wage for a lane transit jumped again. And that was the precise moment, I've thought about this with some care, when the verge divided into the two populations it would keep until the end. The beings who heard the story and concluded the lane was haunted and to be avoided, and the beings who heard it and concluded the lane was safe so long as you followed the rules. Because the thing in the dark gave warnings before it gave subtractions. Both populations were reading the same evidence. Both were half right. The second half of what the second population believed was the half that filled my third column all winter, because they had mistaken a border guard's restraint for a covenant, and restraint is a budget, not a law. It was also in those days that the oscillane left. I should explain the oscillane for whoever reads this ledger in a century. They are the oldest species that deals with the verge, older than our settlement of it, older by their own accounting than the queeting by a very long way, and they maintain 3 trade missions and a habit of silence, and in all my years on this border, no oscillane hull had ever once approached the interdict, by any route, for any tonnage. They took the long way around as if the long way were the only way. We costed it as eccentricity. Old species are permitted their rituals. On the 21st day of the corridor protocol, with the lane running clean and the bookings tripling and the lament bells down to quarter morning, the oscillane missions wound up their accounts, all 3 in a single coordinated week, and withdrew not from the lane which they had never used, but from the verge entire. No protest, no explanation. Their senior factor settling the last dock fees at Telmac in person, with the punctiliousness of a species that has never once in recorded history left a debt behind it, paused at my observation ring on the way to her shuttle and looked for a while at the black margin past the beacon line, where the bunting from the reopening festival still hung on the docking arms. I asked her, because I was past pride by then, and a warden learns to beg where the begging may matter, whether her people knew something of the interdict that mine did not. She considered the question with that unblinking oscillane patience, and what she said I wrote down before her shuttle had cleared my arms, and it sits in the back pages beside the Charon Matriarch's Not Ours, the 2 oldest sentences in my collection. She said, "Warden, we are old enough to remember when there was no line there. We do not avoid the humans because of what is forbidden. We avoid them because we knew them before they were a legend, and the difference between what they were then and what they have made themselves into, since is the most expensive act of will this galaxy has ever witnessed. One does not sail a freight lane through another being's act of will. Mind your bunting, it is in poor taste." Then she left, and her species has not returned to the verge to this day, and the Bureau filed my report of the conversation under commercial intelligence, miscellaneous, and on the 23rd day of the corridor protocol, the tow lines brought in the burned runner with the press packet already written, and the season's great theater began. The Bureau's response to my beacon report was to send me a wreck. It arrived under tow on the 23rd day of the corridor protocol, escorted by 2 patrol cutters and a press packet, and it was announced before it was examined, which tells you everything about what it was for. The bulletins ran the story from one end of the verge to the other before the tow lines were even secured at Telmac. Piracy ring broken in the interdict margin. Raider hulk destroyed by combine escorts. The lane is avenged. The graphic they chose showed the Seleth Vane's pilgrim manifest fading into a sunrise. The hulk itself was real enough. An old Olmec-built runner, weapons fitted, the kind of hull that has carried contraband on every route on the verge for 50 years. It had been found, the escort captains testified, adrift in the outer margin of the lane, already dead, already burned. The Bureau surveyors crawled it for 2 days and emerged with a finding of piracy confirmed, and the lament bells on Chorus Landing stopped altogether, and freight bookings through the lane tripled inside a week. I crawled it too. Telmak's charter gives the lane warden right of survey over any hull berthed at the anchorage, and there was nothing VAR's bureau could do about it short of striking the charter, which would have made its own kind of news. I went in alone with a hand lamp and a material kit and 60 years of knowing what dead ships look like. Because before I was a warden, I was a convoy master, and before I was a convoy master, I was a salvage rigger on the Dresk approaches, and I have been inside more dead hulls than any surveyor the Bureau has ever certified. I will tell you what I found, in the order I found it. The burn patterns were wrong. Plasma scoring fans out from a point of impact. It splashes like any fluid. The scoring on the runner's flanks ran in parallel lines of identical width. No splash, no fan, as if the fire had been applied rather than fired. I have seen torch artists at the Dresk yards decorate hulls with finer control, but never a weapon. The breaches were wrong. A hull holding combat tears outward or punches inward, and either way the metal remembers the violence. It pedals, it shears, it weeps slag. The breaches in the runner were clean ellipses with rolled edges. The metal smoothed back on itself like wax around a wick, and there was no slag anywhere, not a bead of it, and metal does not go anywhere. Mass is the one witness you cannot bribe. Somebody had opened that hull the way you open fruit, and had taken the peel away with them. And the third thing, the thing I did not put in my survey report, because I had a use for it that a report would have spent. The runner's navigation core had been burned. Every chart, every log, every fix, scoured down to the substrate with that same impossible neatness. Except for one entry. One entry had been left or placed, and either word is terrible in its own way. A single stored coordinate, formatted in our own Verge standard notation, sitting alone in the dead core like a coin left on the eyes of a corpse. The coordinate was Telmak Anchorage, this station, my watch chamber, to within a tolerance of 50 paces. I stood in that dead hull with my hand lamp for a long while, and I was not afraid, which surprised me, and I have thought about why ever since. I believe it is this. Fear needs a future to live in, some branching where things might still go one way or the other. What I felt in the runner was the other thing, the older thing. The feeling of standing in a place where the outcome has already been decided by parties who have not bothered to inform you. The pilgrim bells, the press packets, the tripled bookings, VAR's arithmetic, my ledger. All of it was happening inside a verdict that had been rendered before any of us was hatched. They had not destroyed a pirate. I doubted there had ever been a pirate. They had returned a prop, dressed for our theater, addressed, by name, to the one being on the verge who would know how to read it. It was not a warning in the way the bulletins would have screamed had they known. Warnings hoped to change behavior. This was a courtesy. The kind of formal notice one institution sends another. We know your station. We know your watch. We see your lens at the bend. Noted, Warden. Signed, The Dark. I went back to my chamber and I unsealed nothing, and I reported the scoring and the breaches in dry material language, finding inconsistent with combat loss, and the Bureau filed my finding as a dissenting annex, which is where findings go to die. The piracy story held, the lane filled, and 11 days later, the Verge Council announced the thing that the whole season had been sliding toward the Waywater slides toward a drain, the high carriage convoy, the largest single freight movement in the history of the Cassern Verge. 140 laden hulls. They chose the number deliberately, one for each year of the closure. The bulletins called it the answer to a century of fear. Assembling at Telmak at midwinter to run the lane in a single grand passage, with combine escorts at the head and the flank, with the press recorders aboard, with HFY VAR herself embarked on the flagship, the Veliac Crown. 40,000 tons, white-hulled, the newest ship the combine had ever launched. They published the convoy order like a festival program. I read the order in my chamber at night, and I did the only arithmetic that has ever mattered on this border. Not tonnage, not tariffs, geography. To fit 140 hulls through the bend in a single passage, the convoy could not hold the center channel. The formation would be 11 abreast. The outer files would swing 4 light hours wide of the marked lane at the bend's deepest point, wide of the channel, toward the boundary, across the line that none of our charts showed and all of my losses drew. I petitioned for a hearing before the full council, in person under the lane warden's emergency right, a provision so old that the clerks had to look up the form of words for granting it. It had last been invoked 140 years ago by the lane warden of that day, 6 days before the closure. The clerks found that detail charming and the bulletins found it ominous, and I found it neither. I found it familiar, the way a stair is familiar to the foot in the dark. Some offices exist for one purpose that arrives once a century, and the rest of their duties are just the long maintenance of being believed when the purpose comes. 31 years of clean logs and dull annual reports and beacons serviced on schedule. All of it had been for this, for the weight my seal would carry into that chamber, and I tell you honestly, I did not think it would be enough, and I petitioned anyway, because the alternative was to keep the watch in silence, while 140 crews sailed past my window into the dark with festival music playing. The hearing was set for 9 days before the convoy's departure, and on the night before I left for the council seat, Dovell Eth, the old treaty clerk, sent me a message through channels so private they were barely channels at all. It said, "They will give you 1 session. VAR has seen to that much. Do not waste it on instrument readings. They have heard the readings and voted anyway. Unseal the debrief, saveth. Tell them what you have never told anyone. Tell them about the crossing. It is the only thing you have that they cannot file." I sat with that message until the station's morning cycle brought the lights up, and then I went to the archive vault on Telmox's lowest ring, where the sealed records are kept in hard copy behind my own warden's lock, and I took out the debrief I had not touched in 40 years, and I read my own young hand the way the Charon matriarch had read me, every tear of the eye at once. And I will set it down here as I set it down before the council, whole, because the time for spending it carefully has long passed, and because of the 90 ships in my ledger, the only one that ever came back out of that darkness was mine. 40 years ago, I was master of a 4-ship grain caravan out of Dresk, and I was young, and the tariff inspectors at the chorus gates were corrupt in a way that could eat a season's margin, and the old spacers in the bonding houses talk sometimes, late, about the closed lane. How the interdict's outer margin was only a proclamation, not a wall. How a master with cold nerves could cut the long route by 50 days and no patrol would ever know, because no patrol went within a light year of that line. I want to be honest about my reasons before this council, because the record should hold at least one being who was honest about them. I did not cross the line out of courage or curiosity. I crossed it out of arithmetic, the same arithmetic that reopened the lane this year. The margin on grain was thin, and the inspectors were fat, and the dark was free. That is the whole of it. Hunger has always been the gatekeeper's blind spot, and something in that darkness has always known it. We went in at the 3rd hour of the dress calendar's midwinter, 4 ships running silent, my own amber gate leading. I had plotted a route well inside the interdict, but well clear of the boundary of human space as the old charts guessed at it. A guess, I must remind this council, drawn a century before by cartographers who had nothing to survey but absence, who had mapped where ships stopped returning and shaded everything beyond it the way the ancients shaded the edges of sea charts. For 9 days the interdict was nothing. I cannot make the nothing vivid for you, and I have stopped trying. There were stars, fewer than there should have been, and old dead beacons, and a cold so ordinary it was almost a comfort. My crews slept badly and blamed the silence. On the 9th day, my navigator, a gray-crested Dravani named Amel Trass, called me to the chart room and showed me a drift in our fixes, small, patient, accumulating. Some mass our instruments could not find was bending our course, day by day, a degree at a time, not toward the boundary, along it, as if the whole volume were a channel, and we were in a current, and the current had banks. I ordered a correction. The correction took, and then over the next watch it untook, the drift reasserting itself with the gentleness of a hand on a shoulder. Amel ran the figures 3 times and then turned her crest down flat and said, "The thing I have carried for 40 years. Master, the course we are being bent onto is better than the one I plotted. It avoids 3 mass shadows I had not charted. Whatever is steering us knows this volume better than we do. We were being piloted. Unasked, unannounced, by nothing our lenses could find at any range, and the piloting was courteous and competent, and I tell this council plainly that no fear in my long life has ever matched the specific fear of that courtesy. Violence is a language every spacer reads. This was not violence, this was administration. We had crossed into some other authority's records, and the records had simply quietly taken custody of us. On the 11th day, the current set us in a long curve around a mass shadow, and at the bottom of that curve, our lenses found the fleet. I have read what the archivist did to this part of my debrief the first time it was open. They sanded it into wreckage cited. I am an old being now, and I will spend my last credibility saying exactly what we cited because wreckage drifts, and these did not drift. Hulls, hundreds, ranked, coalition hulls from the Queeting, 3 centuries old, the heavy silhouettes from the war memorials on Dresk, and they hung in ordered rows in the dark, bows aligned, spaced like cultivated trees, and every one of them was whole. No breaches, no scoring, no debris bloom, in a volume where no debris had ever come back out. The coalition fleets that went in to break Earth 300 years ago did not die in there, counselors. They were collected, cataloged, shelved in rows in the dark, the way an archive shelves the records of a closed case, and our 4 little grain ships were steered down the length of that. Shelf it dead slow, close enough to read the muster numbers still painted on the bows, and I have never believed that route was an accident. It was the tour the dark gives to trespassers. It was the reading of the verdict aloud. Amel asked me, very quietly, whether the crews of those hulls were still aboard. I told her I did not know. I still do not. There are nights I am certain the not knowing was the entire purpose of the tour. On the 12th day, the voice. It came up out of the silence on our own caravan channel, on our own encryption, which had not been broken because there was nothing to break. It was simply used the way you use a door in your own house. The voice spoke fleet trade Dravani with an accent none of us could place, level, unhurried, neither warm nor cold. A voice with no need in it anywhere. And before any hail, before any challenge, before we had transmitted so much as a carrier tone, it said, Ambergate, caravan of 4, out of dress, grain-laden, bound for chorus by the short dark. You are 11 days deep in a closed volume. It knew my ship. It knew my lading and my port and my course. And we had been silent the whole crossing, and I understood then that our silence had been a child's hands over a child's eyes. The voice did not threaten. It did not ask why we had come. I believe it knew that too, down to the tariff schedules. It said one thing more, and then it never spoke again. And I will give it to this council word for word, because I have carried it word for word through 40 years and 2 interrogations and 1 attempt on my license. The closure is not ours and is not yours. It is a wound's dressing, and it holds because no one picks at it. You will be passed through this once by the bend you entered. Carry this out with you. The lane is not closed to punish you. It is closed because we remember what we did the last time we were made to open it. And we have chosen, at a cost you cannot weigh, never to be made to open it again. Do not mistake our stillness for absence. Do not mistake our patience for sleep. Go home, master. Tell them the dressing holds. Then the current took us, all 4 ships together, and turned us with that same dreadful courtesy, and for 6 days we were carried, there is no other word, back along our own track, past the shelved fleets of the Queeting, out through the bend, and released across the beacon line like a thing set back on a shelf in its proper place. Not one of my crew was harmed. Not one of my instruments ever found the thing that carried us. The Amber Gates logs recorded 18 days of clean, empty running. 18 days of nothing. Except that my navigator never plotted another course. Amel Trask put in for groundwork on Dresk and tends a terrace garden to this day and will not look at a night sky. Except that my 2 junior masters sold their ships within the year. Except that I came to this border and took the lane warden's oath and have spent 31 years making sure the dressing was not picked at. Until this year, counselors, when this body, with 11 mentions of hunger and not 1 mention of memory, picked at it, that is the debrief. That is what is in the hollow reach, not a weapon, not a monster. Something worse than either for our purposes, a keeper, a power that mourns whatever the quieting forced it to become, that has organized 3 centuries of unbroken vigilance around the single resolve never to become it again, and that has now watched 90 of our ships, one by one, cross the line it drew around its own grief. You ask what is taking your ships. Counselors, your ships are not being taken. They are being confiscated. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole of my testimony. Taking is appetite. Confiscation is procedure. Appetite sates. Procedure escalates. Cancel the convoy. Close the lane. Ring it with beacons and teach your children's children that it is not a road. It was never a road. It is the marked perimeter of the only mercy our region of the galaxy has ever been shown, extended once, by a power that knew our names in the dark and asked nothing in return but distance. That is what I told the Verge Council in the 9th day session, under the emergency right last invoked 140 years ago. The chamber was silent for the length of my testimony, and the silence felt, for 1 hour, like the turning of a tide. Then the Combine's senior delegate rose and thanked me for a moving account of events 4 decades past and conditions which could not be verified, and moved to proceed to the scheduled vote on the convoy's escort budget. The motion carried. The convoy sailed in 9 days, and Hesheline Var, who had sat through my testimony without moving, with her hands folded the way she had folded them over my ledger, voted with the majority, and then did the one thing I had not foreseen, the thing that has kept me from ever hating her since. She transferred her flag of office to the convoy's outermost ship, the most exposed hull and the most exposed file of the formation, the position my lost geography marked as first to be subtracted, and she embarked her own children's portraits and her predecessor's ashes with her, and she sent me one line by the private channel on the night before departure. Warden, if your keeper takes the straggler first, then the straggler will be me, and the verge will have its verification, and you will have your closure votes by morning. Keep counting. Var earned the right to send that message, and the verge never learned how. I will set it down because she cannot, and because the inquiry that later assigned her the blame was never told the half of what she spent in those 9 days trying to deserve a different verdict. On the night after the vote, while the council seats corridors were still loud with the combine celebrations, Dovaleth brought me down into the archive levels under the chamber, to the room where the verge keeps its dead treaties. He was past 90 then, walking with 2 canes, and he had spent 60 years filing the agreements of being's long dust, and he wanted to show me a drawer. In the drawer were charts, not ours, older, pre-council, the working atlases of the first survey generations, paper and lacquer, the originals from which every chart of the Cassern Verge descends. He turned the leaves with a clerk's gloves until he found the margin he wanted, and there, beside the earliest drawn boundary of the interdict, in the small, careful hand of a cartographer 200 years gone, was a notation that had never been carried forward into any later edition. Eth had found it as a young clerk and had kept it to himself for 60 years, he said, because he had never until this season met the official it was addressed to. The notation read, "This line is not a finding. It is a promise made to us. Successors keep it without knowing why. Knowing why is the cost." We stood in that cold paper smelling room, 2 old functionaries with a lamp, reading a sentence sent up 2 centuries like a flare. Eth said, "Every generation of this council has inherited the line without the reason, and every generation has held it a little more cheaply, and you have just watched the first generation hold it cheaply enough to sell. I have no vote and you have no standing, but she has both, and she asked for the transcript of your testimony an hour after the session closed. Whatever she does in the next 9 days saveth, help her do it." What she did was the Andrast. The Andrast was a survey corvette, guild-registered, crew of 9, and Hesselin Var chartered her with discretionary funds through 3 layers of intermediary and sent her up the lane 2 days after the vote. Dark, transponder altered, with orders written in Var's own hand, and a guild surveyor aboard whose instruments were the finest on the verge. The mission was simple, and it was everything. Fly to the bend, hold station short of the line my losses drew, chart the beacon funnel at close range, and come back with data so unimpeachable that no delegate could call it a hermit's delirium. She was not defying her own council's vote. She was trying in the last days before the convoy to buy the evidence that would let her move for reconsideration. It was the act of a being who had heard my testimony entire, and I will not have it forgotten. The Andrast reached the bend in 4 days, and for 1 full day, I had her on my own lenses, and her telemetry came down the private channel to my chamber and to Var's offices, and nowhere else. She did exactly what no vessel of ours had done in 140 years. She stood still in the throat of the dark and measured it. The data came down clean, and it confirmed everything, and it was worse than everything. The funnel was not 6 beacons. At close range, her instruments resolved 61 objects holding formation along the bend. Our 6 dead beacons, the monument buoy, and 54 bodies her surveyor could not classify at all. Dark, cold, regular in spacing with no emissions in any spectrum, reading on the mass instruments as present and on every other instrument as absent. The formation extended past the boundary of human space in an unbroken line, and the surveyor's final transmitted note. She was a guildmaster with 40 years of fieldwork, and her voice on the recording is as flat as a being can make a voice, was this: "The alignment tolerances are 4 decimal places finer than guild standard. Whoever stations these maintains them. This is not a ruin. This is infrastructure, and it is in service. And I withdraw my profession's 2-century-old finding that this volume is dead. Recommend immediate." The transmission did not cut. That is the detail I need whoever reads this to sit with. Every loss on the lane that whole season had been a subtraction in silence between position calls. The Andrast stream stayed live to the end, 11 minutes past the surveyor's last word, and what it carried in those 11 minutes was the sound of 9 beings in a small hull discovering that their helm had gone soft and their bow was coming around, unhurried, courteous, onto a heading none of them had laid in. Not back down the lane toward home, but inward, across the line. The last clear words on the recording are the Andrast's young master, very quietly, to her crew, "Belay the engines, don't fight the elbow." And then, to the open channel, to us, to me, "Tell Mock we are taken in tow. Tell the warden the funnel has a far end and we are going to see it. Log us as collected, not lost." Then the stream compressed into carrier tone, and the carrier tone held for 6 hours at a steadiness no drive of ours can produce. And somewhere past the boundary of human space it ended the way a ledger line ends, ruled off, and the Andrast joined my 3rd column. though I obeyed her master, and beside the word none I wrote, for the only time that season, the word collected, and I have never struck it through. Var came to me by the private channel that night, and there was no officialdom left in her voice. She said, I sent 9 beings to die proving you right, and the proof cannot even be shown. If I table this data, the Combine tables my charter of the Andras beside it, an illegal dark flight in defiance of a standing vote, and the data dies with my seat, and the convoy sails, regardless under whichever successor they fit into it by week's end. I have run it every way it runs, Warden. The convoy cannot be stopped from inside this chamber, so I am going to be aboard it. Not to share the risk. Do not let anyone write that I shared the risk. The risk was never equally distributed, and we both know which berth it falls on. I am going to be aboard it because the straggler position is an instrument now, the last unimpeachable instrument the Verge has left, and someone whose death cannot be filed under crew error has to be standing on it when the reading comes. I told her what I had never told the council, about the coordinate in the Burn Runner's core, Telmic anchorage, 50 paces. That the thing in the dark already knew which offices on this border kept honest books, and that it had never once subtracted an honest bookkeeper. I told her, it takes the ones who cross the line carelessly, and it took the Andras gently, and it has never taken a warden. Whatever it is doing, it is not harvesting, it is administering. Stand on your instrument if you must, HFY. But know that the reading you die delivering will be filed by the same bureau that filed all of mine. There was a long silence on the channel. Then she said the truest thing any official of her generation ever said to me, I know, saveth, but it will also be carried by every pilot in every bonding house on this verge, forever, and you taught me which of those 2 archives is the one that holds. And then the line about the straggler, and keep counting, and she closed the channel. And 4 days later the founding settlements were read out file by file under the festival music, and I stood at my ring in the warden's grays and watched her go. I want to set down what the 9 days before the convoy were like at Telmac, because the bulletins recorded only the festival, and my ledger recorded only the arithmetic, and the truth of those days lived in between, in the small behaviors of beings who knew. The pilots knew first. Pilots always know first. The lane had official odds now. The actuarial houses on Chorus had finally been forced to publish, and the published number was 1 loss in 11 transits, and freight masters can read a number like that as well as any underwriter. The wages for a lane transit tripled, then tripled again. The bonding houses began writing dead crew clauses into contracts a full season before the lament orders thought to ask for them. And the oldest pilots, the gray crests who had flown the long route all their lives and had the least life left to lose, would not take the lane at any wage. I asked one of them, an Olmec named Barahole who had flown freight for 60 years, why the young ones signed and the old ones refused. She said, Warden, the young think death is a thing that happens to you. The old know it is a place you can walk into. That lane has a threshold. I have flown past it for 60 years, and I have never once heard it asked to be crossed. My own station crew began to thin. Quietly, without scenes, a transfer request here, an accumulated leave filing there, a junior beacon tech who simply did not return from rotation. I signed every release without comment. By the convoy's assembly week, Telmac Anchorage ran on 11 beings out of a complement of 40, and the 11 who stayed were all, without exception, beings who had been at the station longer than the reopening. We never spoke of why we stayed. There is a kind of staying that is loyalty to a place, and a kind that is witness duty, and ours was the second kind, and all 11 of us knew it. The convoy assembled across 4 days, and I will grant the spectacle its due. It was the grandest thing the Verge had ever built. 140 laden hulls in parking ranks off Telmac's southern arms, the Veliac crown white at their head, escort cutters stitching the formation's flanks, and the press recorders broadcasting the ranks to every station on the Verge with music underneath. Var's bureau had named the formation files after the founding settlements. Children on Chorus Landing were taught the file names in school that week. I am told there were pageants. I spent the 4 days at the long lens watching the bend. The beacons had moved again. Not drifted, moved. The 6 dead interior beacons, which had aligned themselves along the lane's axis on the 17th night of the corridor protocol, had spent the season since in slow redeployment, spreading outward from the lane's center line into a broad funnel, a flared mouth opening toward us. I had reported it. The Bureau had filed it under debris drift. But a funnel is not a drift pattern, and I had surveyed enough harbors in my rigging years to know what I was looking at, because every port in civilized space builds the same shape at its entrance, a reception channel, marked out in our own dead beacons in the dark. With 3 centuries of patience, they knew the convoy was coming. They had read our bulletins or our traffic or our minds. I no longer pretended to know the mechanism, and they had prepared the approach the way a harbor prepares for a fleet it has been told to expect, and the preparation had no anger in it anywhere, and that was the worst of it. Anger can be provoked into error. Procedure cannot. I sent one final report up the channel the night before departure, with the funnel charted and one line of annotation. The lane is no longer a lane. It is now a door, and doors belong to whoever builds the frame. The Bureau did not even file that one. It came back marked return to sender, hold for post-transit review. Somewhere in the traffic office, a clerk had finally been honest. The Verge would consider the evidence after the experiment had been run on live crews. Departure came at the 3rd hour, midwinter, 40 years to the season, though no bulletin marked it, since a young grainmaster had crossed the same line in the dark to dodge a tariff. The formation lit its drives in sequence, file by file, the founding settlements called out by name over the public channel as each file answered, and the broadcast music swelled, and on my observation ring the 11 of us stood in our grays and watched 140 ships make way toward the beacon line, stately, ranked, 11 abreast, banners of drive light against that starless margin. I had done everything an office can do. I want that recorded, not for my own account, but for the office, for whoever keeps this watch after me, because the lesson is the office's lesson. I had logged, objected, petitioned, surveyed, testified, unsealed the one possession I had spent 40 years protecting, and spent it whole. The machinery of the Verge had heard all of it, weighed all of it, and sailed anyway. There is a grief specific to functionaries, and it is this: to be believed and overruled in the same breath by beings who would rather audit a catastrophe than absorb a warning. I felt very old. Watching those drives recede, and then in the next breath I did not feel old at all. I felt like the youngest being on the Verge, the only one still capable of dread, surrounded by elders who had legislated theirs away. The convoy crossed my beacon line at the 6th hour. I logged the crossing, 140 hulls, 31,406 souls, by the manifests, and the 3rd column of my ledger lay open on the console, blank waiting, and I sat the watch. For 2 days, the lane behaved. Position calls came up the relay in good order, file by file. The press recorders broadcast from the Veliac Crown's gallery. The old monument buoy passing to starboard, crews at festival mess, Var giving a measured address about commerce and courage in which she did not once use the word human, and I noted that even now, even sailing into it, the Verge could not say the name of the thing it was testing. On the 3rd day the convoy reached the bend, and the formation, as the geometry demanded and as I had testified it must, widened, 11 abreast through the narrows, the outer file swinging 4 light hours wide of the marked channel, out past the line that no chart showed. The first interval came at the 3rd day's 9th hour. The outermost ship of the outermost file missed a position call. Her name was the Ledger of Aves. I have always declined to find meaning in that and always failed. She was a mid-tonnage grain hull, crew of 31, and she was the straggler, the most exposed ship in the most exposed file. The position my lost geography had marked, the position HFY Var had claimed for her own flag. But Var was not aboard her. The Combine's escort commanders, in the only act of that whole season I would call wisdom, had quietly countermanded the council seat's bravado on the 2nd night and moved her flag back to the Veliac Crown at the formation's heart against her recorded protest, while the broadcast music played. So the dark took the straggler, as it had taken every straggler, and the straggler was 31 strangers whose names I copied into my ledger at the 9th hour, and the experiment Var had designed to spend her own life verifying was verified instead, as such experiments always are, on crews whose names no council member had ever learned. And then the intervals began to come the way midwinter comes on Dresk, not as events, as weather. The relay board at Telmac carries 1 lamp for every transmitting hull on the lane. On the 3rd night of the convoy's passage, I sat before 139 green lamps, and I watched them go out, not in panic, not in cascade. That is the part I have never made anyone feel who was not in the chamber, and I will try one last time here. The lamps went out one at a time, at intervals of some minutes, in order, always the outermost surviving ship, always the most exposed remaining hull, as if the dark were working inward through the formation by rank, by file, by some unhurried protocol of seniority. A lamp would go green to black between one breath and the next, then nothing, for 4 minutes or 7, or 11. Then the next. There was no traffic on the emergency channels for the 1st hour, because each ship's master saw only their own neighbor vanish and assumed a relay fault. The subtraction was that clean. It was the escort commanders who understood first, the way soldiers understand weather that civilians call coincidence, and at the 4th night's 2nd hour the convoy's discipline broke, and the emergency band lit with 100 voices at once. Masters hailing dead neighbors, files breaking formation, drives flaring as the inner ranks understood at last that the protection of the herds Center was not protection, it was sequence. It was their place in the order of confiscation. I want to record what the escorts did, because they were brave, and bravery deserves a ledger even when it purchases nothing. The combine cutters turned outward, all of them. They put themselves between the formation and the dark on every flank. Weapons live, lenses burning at full sweep, and they found nothing to fight, because there has never been anything to fight, and they were subtracted in their turn, lamp by lamp, escorts and grain hulls alike, in that same patient seniority of exposure, and not one weapon discharged in all that long night, ours or theirs. The instruments are unanimous on this. Across 4 hours of annihilation, there was not a single act of violence in the recorded spectrum. Only removal, only the dark, balancing its books. By the fourth night's 6th hour, one lamp remained, the Veliac crown. She had stopped transmitting position calls and stopped answering hails, but her carrier wave held, green and steady at the center of my dead board, and she held it for 2 days. 2 days, alone at the bottom of the bend in the middle of that marked-out funnel of beacons, the last lit lamp on the Cassern verge. I did not sleep. I do not believe anyone on the verge slept. The bulletins had gone first to confusion, then to silence, and the silence spread station to station until the whole civilization I had spent a life serving was gathered, in effect, around my one green lamp, the way a household gathers at the door of a sick room. On the 6th day, the Veliac crown's lamp went black. I logged the hour, and 11 minutes later, I will give the figure exactly, 11 minutes, the length of a watch change. Every relay on the lane carried one transmission in clear on every channel at once, in flat, unaccented machine renderings of all 4 trade languages of the verge. It was 9 words. The lane is closed. Tend your side of it. That was all. No terms, no claim, no accounting of the 31,000 souls. The Dark had sent the verge a notice of administrative action, and the notice was the entire war, beginning and end. And there has never been a sound in my long life so loud as the channels in the minute after it, which carried nothing at all. The crown's lamp going dark was not the end, though. I must write the end with a steady hand, because it came to my own threshold. On the 9th day after the transmission, Telmach's approach lenses raised a contact inbound from the bend. One hull, running slow on the exact center of the marked channel, position calls sounding in perfect order, and the transponder gave the name, Veliac Crown. She came up the lane at funeral speed and crossed my beacon line at the 3rd hour, 40,000 tons of white hull, unbreached, unscorched, every running light burning, and she answered no hails. And when my boarding crews met her at the southern arms, they found her empty in a way I must be precise about. Not abandoned, emptied, 31,000 berths made up, mess halls cleaned and secured, cargo lashed. The press gallery's recorders, neatly racked, their storage wiped to substrate. Every personal effect of every soul aboard arranged on every bunk with the terrible orderliness of an estate prepared for executors. Portraits squared, garments folded, and on the flag deck, Hesseline Var's predecessor's ashes set in the center of the chart table, and beside the urn her chain of office coiled, polished, returned, no crew, no remains, no disorder, no answers. The Dark had kept the ships and the souls, all but this one hull which it had not spared but spent, dressed and provisioned and steered back across the line as deliberately as a document is served. The young surveyors called it mercy. One ship returned out of 90. The old pilots knew better, Barahul knew better, I knew better. You do not return a 40,000-ton flagship in perfect order as mercy, you return it as a receipt. And her navigation corps held a single stored entry. You already know what it was, because you have heard this account this far in the Dark is nothing if not consistent in its correspondence. One coordinate, Vergy standard notation. Telmach anchorage. This station, this chamber, 50 paces. I have been asked 1,000 times since, by the inquiry boards, by the lament orders, by the one archivist I still permit to visit, what I believe the coordinate means, whether it is a threat. I no longer answer the boards, but I will answer here, in the ledger's back pages, where the things with no column live. It is not a threat, it is an address. Every institution that keeps a long vigil learns to identify its counterpart across the line, the opposite number, the other being whose lamp burns at the other end of the silence. For 31 years I had watched their border and counted their consistencies, and somewhere in that ranked and shelving dark, something had been doing the same to me, logging my objections as I logged their subtractions, reading my annotations going up the channel and watching them come back, struck through, keeping, I have come to believe, its own third column, in its own hand, in whatever serves it for a margin. The coordinate is not "we are coming for you, warden." The coordinate is "we know which of them was keeping the watch." It is the only acknowledgement one warden's office has ever paid the other. It is, in the bookkeeping of powers, a signature witnessing a signature, and there are nights, I confess it here and nowhere else, when I read it as something even barer than that. As the loneliest sentence in the galaxy sent across a wound 3 centuries wide, from a keeper to a keeper, you at least understood. Tend your side of it. The Veliot crown lay at my southern arms for 40 days, while the Verge decided what it was allowed to mean, and those 40 days taught me more about my own civilization than the whole catastrophe that preceded them. The first lesson came within hours. The surveyors the Bureau sent, the same office that had filed my findings into annexes all season, boarded her in hazard suits with their instruments calibrated for contagion, for radiation, for trap mechanisms, for every category of threat their training contained, and they found a ship in perfect trim and nothing whatsoever in their categories. And category failure does to institutions what fear does to crews. Their preliminary report ran 400 pages and concluded nothing, and the Bureau classified it, and the classification leaked in 2 days, and the leak said what leaks always say, which is everything garbled. By the 10th day half, the Verge believed the crown had returned crewed by the dead, and the other half believed there had never been a convoy at all, and the Bureau's season of managed truth bore its final fruit. When the institutions most needed to be believed, they had spent it. The second lesson was quieter, and it frightened me more. Stations began dimming. It started on the outermost settlements, the ones nearest the interdict's long margin, habitats cutting their beacon output, their traffic emissions, their navigational broadcasts, down to minimums, then below minimums. No ordinance required it, no council voted it. The behavior simply propagated inward, station by station, the way silence propagates around a sickbed, and when the Verge-owned traffic authority queried the dimming stations for explanation, the replies that came back were not policy. They were instinct, wearing whatever official language each station master could find for it, reducing discretionary signature, conserving emitter stock. And from the old station master at Veld Anchorage, who had been a relay apprentice under Code and Vry and had no patience left for language. We have spent a year shouting our manifests into a dark that writes down names. I am done being legible. The galaxy's whole long quiet around human space, the avoidance my generation inherited as map shading and mistook for superstition, I watched it, being laid down fresh in real time, one frightened station at a time, the way sediment lays down stone. It is not a law and was never a law. It is a flinch, learned at full price, and we had just paid the tuition all over again so that our grandchildren could inherit the flinch without the receipts. The third lesson was Doval Eth's, and it was his last. He came up from the council seat on the quarantine packet, 93 years old, 2 canes against the advice of every physician he had outlived, because he said there was a filing that had to be made in person. In the deep archive under the chamber, in the drawer with the dead treaties and the lacquered atlases he had found, he had known for 60 years where it was, is the truth of it. A document folio sealed by the lane wardens and clerks of the closure, generation 140 years before. Not the session minutes, those were sealed by law, this was sealed only by dust. A working folio, the closure generation's private estimate of their successors, and it contained one item, a motion, drafted, formatted, and left blank at the date line, with a clerk's note pinned to it that Eth read aloud to the emergency session with his canes braced against the gut rostrum, and which I will copy here from the official record because it deserves the ink. The note read, "To the clerks of whatever council reopens the lane, we do not reproach you. The reasons will have been arithmetic, and arithmetic is honest even when it is wrong. We have drafted your closure motion for you, because you will need it within 2 years of the reopening, and you will not be able to think clearly when you do. Change nothing in it. The wording matters. Some of it was given to us. The council adopted the 140-year-old motion without amendment by acclamation in a session that lasted 11 minutes. The clerks noted the duration without comment, and I will likewise let it lie. And the wording did matter. The motion did not close the lane as a hazard which can be resurveyed, or as a wartime measure which can lapse, or in memoriam, which softens into heritage. It closed the lane as a boundary recognized, the only phrase of its kind in Verge law, and in the definitions clause, where a century of clerks would otherwise have whittled, the drafters had set their one inheritance from the message their own warden had carried out, of the dark. A boundary recognized is not maintained by the party that drew it. It is maintained by the parties that benefit from never learning why it was drawn. Eth stayed at Telmac after the session. He had no family living and no appetite for the council seat's funerals of reputation, and I had empty quarters and the only other set of books on the Verge he still respected. He spent his last winter in my watch chamber, wrapped in a thermal robe, watching the lens feeds from the bend with the contentment of a clerk whose accounts have finally closed, and he died at the start of the thaw season in his sleep on the night I checked the logs, because he would have wanted me to check the logs, that the last of the 61 objects in the funnel completed its slow withdrawal from our side of the line, and the bend went back to being merely dark. We buried him in the warden's plot on Telmach's sunward face, beside the wardens of the closure generation, under a marker that gives his name, his office, and the one line he asked for, which was not about the dark at all. He kept the files. I have wondered since whether the withdrawal of the funnel on that particular night was coincidence. The young ones would say it had to be. Nothing across that line could know or care that one old clerk's breathing had stopped in a station it had marked to 50 paces. But I have read the correspondence of the dark for 31 years. The runner, the receipt, the coordinate, the gentleness with honest bookkeepers. And I have come to believe that it cares about exactly one thing on our side of the wound, and that the thing is record-keeping, and that it knows when a great keeper of records leaves his desk, the way one lighthouse knows when another goes dark across a strait. I cannot defend this in a hearing. I no longer attend hearings. The inquiry, the blame, the steel, the dissolution of the Combine, all of that came after in the gray procedural years, and I will rule those accounts in their turn. But the 40 days of the crown at my arms ended with one more entry, and it belongs here at the end of the lessons. On the 40th day, the Bureau ordered the Veliac crown scuttled in the deep yards off Dresk, too haunted to crew, too storied to scrap, the same calculation the closure generation must once have made about an earlier hull, for there is a sealed berth in the Dresk deep yards on no public registry, and I know now what is in it. And on the morning the tugs came for her, my junior watch, the last apprentice Eth ever trained, called me to the lens room, because something on the crown's white flank had changed in the night, and nothing could have boarded her, and nothing had. Along her bow, where a ship of ours carries its registry, the white hull plating had been altered, the metal itself reworked, with that neatness I knew from the runner's breeches, the neatness of a hand that does not waste, into a single line of characters in flawless verdure. Standard script, sized to be read by a station lens, placed where every tug crew and every yard worker and every archivist pulling the file a century, hence would have to read it first. The line said, paid in full. Do not draw on this account again. The tugs towed her out at the third hour. I countersigned the yard transfer, the last document in the operational file of the high carriage convoy, and ruled the line. What remained after that belonged not to the watch but to the clerks, and the clerks, as ever, were given the largest share of the burying. The aftermath was bureaucratic, as the worst aftermaths are. There was no war to fight, no enemy to indict, no wreckage to bury. There was paperwork. The Verge Council met in closed session for 19 days, the longest closed session in its history, and what emerged was not a declaration but an erasure. The lane was not merely closed, it was struck. Every chart on the Cassern Verge was recalled to the Cartographers Guild on Chorus Landing and reissued within a season, and on the reissued charts the old transit corridor does not appear as a forbidden route, or a hazard, or a memorial. It does not appear at all. The Guild redrew the margin of Interdict 9-4 light days farther out, swallowing the lane whole, and shaded the new volume in the flat gray reserved for unsurveyed mass. And where the old charts had carried the quarter's designation, the new ones carry nothing. Not a name, not a warning, only the blankness that cartographers leave when they have been instructed, very quietly, that some knowledge is a hazard to navigation. I was sent the new master chart for the warden's counter signature. That is the custom. The lane warden witnesses all revisions to the border charts. I unrolled it across the same console where I had watched the lamps go out, and I found my station at the edge of that new gray blankness, and I understood that I was countersigning the only treaty the Verge would ever be offered. A treaty written entirely in absence, ratified entirely in silence, whose single clause was the 9 words every relay on the border had carried. I signed. It is the proudest signature of my life, and it sits on a document that officially records nothing. The sealed minutes of the closure of 140 years ago were opened by emergency vote, 60 years ahead of their term. I was permitted to read them as a serving warden. I will not quote them, that permission was not given. I will say only this. The lane warden of that day had also crossed the line, had also been carried back, had also been given a message to carry out. And the message in those old minutes, and the message in my 40-year-old debrief, agree in every particular but one. The old message ended differently. It ended, while we remember you are safe from us, and we are very good at remembering. The wardens of that generation chose to hear comfort in it. I have kept the watch too long to hear comfort. I hear the other edge, that the safety of every civilization on this verge rests not on our fleets, our councils, or our arithmetic, but on the unbroken discipline of someone else's grief, and that twice now in 3 centuries it has been our hunger that tested the discipline, and twice their grief that held. Hesselin Var's name is on the memorial stele at Chorus Landing with the 31,000, though her body, like all of them, was never returned. The inquiry assigned her the largest share of blame, as inquiries assign blame to the dead, who do not contest findings. I filed a dissenting annex, my last one, recording that she was the only official of her generation who read the whole ledger, the only one who asked to hear the debrief, and the only one who offered her own life to the straggler's birth, and that the difference between her and the rest of her council was not wisdom but courage, which arrives, in officials, one generation too late to matter. The annex was filed. Filed is the kindest word in the bureaucratic language. It means buried with a marker. The combine dissolved within 2 years. The grain stations were fed by the long route after all. The arithmetic that had been impossible was found, after 90 ships and 31,000 souls, to be merely expensive. That is a sentence I have written slowly. Every closed lane in the galaxy is closed by exactly that sentence, learned at exactly that price, and every generation that inherits the closure inherits the sentence without the price. And that is how the dressing comes to be picked at again. I no longer believe the hollow reaches the danger. The danger is actuarial. The danger is any council, anywhere a century from now, looking at a blank gray volume on a chart and seeing only the 51 days of transit it would save. The old pilots have already begun the only defense that has ever worked, folklore. Barahul flew her last run the year after the convoy and spent her grounding years in the bonding houses, not the inquiries version, not the bulletins but the pilot's version, smoothed and hardened, the way oral things are smoothed and hardened, until it could survive being carried. In her version, the lane is not a route that was closed but a debt that is serviced by distance, and the dark is not empty but tended, and somewhere beyond the bend there is a white flagship crewed by made beds, sailing home forever with a receipt in its heart. The academies on dress call her version superstition. Good. Superstition cannot be audited, cannot be struck through, cannot be overruled 6 days by return packet. Superstition is the only filing system that survives its own councils. If the Verge is alive in 300 years, it will be because the children frightened by Barahul's story grew old refusing, without ever being able to defend the refusal in a hearing, to look at that gray blankness and see a road. As for me, the council offered me retirement with honors, which is what institutions offer witnesses they would prefer to have remembered fondly and seldom. I declined. I am old, but the oath I took has no term in it, and besides, there is the matter of the correspondence. Twice now, something across that line has taken the trouble to learn which lamp on this border was lit by a keeper. Twice it has sent its receipt to this chamber, to 50 paces. Whatever ledgers are kept in that ranked and silent dark, my station is an entry in them, and an entry should not be left to go suddenly blank. They would notice. I find I do not want them to notice. Of all the duties I hold, that is the one I never swore and cannot explain to the inquiry boards. The duty not to vanish from the records of the thing that watches, lest it conclude that no one on this side is tending the wound any more. So I keep the watch. The 11 of us who stayed have become 9 then 7. The young replacements come up from Dresk knowing the convoy only as a steal and a school pageant, and I teach them the instruments and the protocols, and last of all, when I judge them ready, I walk them down to the archive vault and let them read the third column, the groove. Worn into the page, the 90 names, the one word repeated until it stopped being a word and became what it always was, a boundary stone. Some of them transfer out within the season. The ones who stay changed, and those are the ones I trust with the lens at the bend. The bend is quiet now. The beacons hold their funnel shape, aligned, attended, lit by nothing, pointing down the throat of a road that no chart on the Verge admits ever existed. Nothing has crossed the line in either direction since the morning the Veliac crown came home empty. On clear watches, when the relay is silent and the young ones are asleep, I sit with the ledger open to its last page and I look out at that starless margin, and I think about a level voice on a dead channel that knew my ship's name 40 years ago, and about what it must cost to stand a vigil 3 centuries long over the worst thing you have ever done, so that you are never made to do it again. We tell each other, on this side, that the dark beyond the bend is forbidden. The longer I keep this watch, the more certain I become that we have the grammar of it backward. That volume was never forbidden to us. We are what was forbidden to it. And every light on my board, every name in my ledger, every blank gray sector on every reissued chart is part of the same long sentence the galaxy is, still learning to read, that the quietest border in creation is quiet because the thing on the other side keeps its word, and the word it keeps is, never again. The relay is silent tonight. The lamps are green from here to chorus. I have made the entry and ruled the line, and the watch goes on. Both of them.